Hey everyone, welcome back to Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly. I'm Jake Wynn. Today it's just me on the mic for an interview, and I am joined by my friend Damian Shiels, who is calling in from Finland. Damian just published a terrific new book, Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, and we have a great discussion about Damian's research and his efforts to redefine the experience of Irish American soldiers in the American Civil War. We also talk about his digital history efforts and the story he's telling on the Transatlantic podcast. Quick favor before we dive in. Please subscribe to the podcast, and if you've got a minute, leave a rating and a review. It helps more people to find the show. All right, here's my conversation with Damian Shiels. All right, so we are here with my good friend Damian Shiels, who is beaming in to the Public History podcast from across the world. Damian, how are you doing? For me, this morning. For you, this afternoon.
Yeah, great, Jake. It is dark here already, mind you. Coming to you live from Finland, so. Yeah, where our days are pretty short at this time of the year, but it's good to be with you. Nice to be on the podcast. Long time listener.
Yeah, happy to have you here. I feel like this is fun because I am an avid follower of Transatlantic, your podcast with Finn Dwyer. So it's fun to hear your voice and be able to talk back to you and not just be listening in.
And Jake, your episode, just to let you know at the outset, Jake joined us to speak about the Pennsylvania coal region in the 19th century, the Irish there, remains the most popular episode of the series.
Love it.
Of all of them so far. So there you go.
That's amazing. You're
getting it from the horse's mouth on this podcast. So this is the one you should be listening to.
Excellent. So curious, I was just in the Pacific Northwest. I know we were just talking about this before we jumped online. And they refer to this time of year, of course, recording this in the winter, they refer to this time of year as the Big Dark, which I just love that. Do they refer to that as anything in Finland there? Because I imagine it's pretty dark there this time of year.
Yeah, it's nearly fully dark now. We kind of go down to where I live. We go down to about 4 hours of light, but like today, there's been virtually no light because of the cloud. They must do, actually. That's a very good question, but I don't know what they do call it. One of our big problems at the moment is normally if I looked out and I'm looking out at the forest trees out the back here as I'm speaking to you, normally we would have a blanket of snow here at this time of year, but it's all melted in the last few days. Like it's unseasonably warm, like it's above freezing. And the snow actually makes an enormous difference to the light levels, even when it's fully dark. Like you can still see with the snow, but when you can't, it's pretty depressing. You know, I come from Ireland where we complain about rain and the weather all the time, and we're far too close to Irish weather at the moment in Finland than I would like, I have to say.
Yeah. you fled that weather for much colder climate, and now you're back in.
I've been cheated, Jake.
Brought you onto the pod today just to kind of talk about some of the Irish and American history connections that you've been working on for a long time and recently published in 2025 a great book, which I have just finished. I will admit, I just finished this as we were prepping for the podcast. But Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865. And just wanted to talk with you a little bit about the book, your process, what went into it. I know this has been a long run up to getting this book out just because of the nature of the research that you did for this book, which makes it in a really, really important addition to Civil War scholarship. So if you just want to tell listeners, Damian, a little bit about Green and Blue and what you were trying to do with the book.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, and thanks for the kind words about it. Yeah, it is kind of, I suppose, the magnum opus of about 15 years of work I've been doing on the Irish experience of the conflict. And I suppose it's fair to say I come from a kind of an odd background in relation to doing this because it's published in an academic press and everything. And I did do a PhD on large aspects of it, but it all actually started through public history and through initially a blog, Irish and the American Civil War, that I set up in 2010, which I had started to set up really because I didn't feel there was a huge amount of awareness within Ireland of the extent of Irish involvement. So I started doing things like the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg, all that's kind of standard fare in relation to the Irish. But I come from a archaeology and history background. That's what I do for a living all the time, and I kind of like doing primary research. So I was quite fortunate because I was living in Ireland at the time. It was a long way from archives relating to Irish service in the United States. But quite quickly I came upon this incredible resource called the Widow's Pension Files, which I'm sure particularly your Civil War listeners will be familiar with, these pensions that were given out by the US government that relate to people who tended to lose loved ones, who died of disease, were killed in battle, or who died subsequent to their service. And so widows and dependent parents and children could apply for these. And a lot of these had been digitised. About 144,000 of the army ones, I think, had been digitised. So I said, I'll look at these. And I started to look at them, and then I went, oh, wow, there's letters in some of these. There are letters that widows and that parents were handing into the United States government that were written by soldiers during the war who did not survive the war, that they were given in to try and prove their relationship to them and their entitlement to a pension. And after a few months, it quickly became apparent to me, this is a kind of a completely, in an Irish context, unknown source for contemporary letters. Irish Americans during the war, and I'm talking about ordinary enlisted working class Irish Americans here, aren't supposed to have left a lot of this documentation behind. So obviously, what do, Jake? You then start, in every spare waking moment that you have across 8 years, systematically going through all of the digitized files that are available, which is only a small proportion of the total number of files. But I went through them all to try and extract letters, to try and get a sense of the wider Irish experience, because so often we reduce it to the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg, the Irish Brigade at Antietam, the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg, usually the Irish Brigade at somewhere. And it's a much wider story because most of these people didn't serve in what I would call ethnic green flag units. And so that was kind of the background to where I came upon that. And I, wrote about little bits and pieces on the blog over the years. But I was very unfortunate because of my online work to begin to get opportunities to go to the United States to talk a bit about Civil War topics. And on one of those trips, I encountered Professor David Gleeson, who is the main historian of the Irish in the South and in the Confederate forces as well. And David said, you should do a PhD on that. And I went, yeah, that I would like to do that. so I took that database and all those letters, and I went off and did that analysis to try and give this wider story, a more complete story, I think, on the Irish experience. So previously, and there's been some incredible work done by a relatively small cohort of historians, quite dedicated historians, like Susanna Urel, Ryan Keating, Catherine Bateson, and so on, to look. I wanted to use this to see what can these ordinary guys' letters tell us about this wider experience of the conflict. And so that's kind of what the book is trying to do, to say, where do these guys serve, how many of them were there, and then explore their experience in that kind of classic Civil War soldier study sort of mold.
Yeah, I think the thing I found most interesting, I felt like really honed in on just thinking about these experiences of, as you mentioned, your focus is not on these units with, as you said, the green flag units, these traditionally Irish and known Irish units that are very strongly identified with Ireland and with the Irish immigrant experience. To look at those ones that are look at these men that are in these units that are from all over the place and may have just a few Irish members in those regiments and their experiences of kind of being bonded together based on their experience. I found fascinating, and it helped me to, I've focused on some of the units that came from northeastern Pennsylvania and going through those rosters and looking at their stories. You'll come across there's contingents of Irish, there's contingents of Germans. In fact, the unit that I look at the most frequently is the 96th Pennsylvania, which had a lot of Germans, and so they got nicknamed by a neighboring New York unit, the illiterate sauerkraut-eating lunkheads, which I just love. But there's a sizable group of Irish immigrants because, understandably so, a lot of them came out of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, which had a large Irish immigrant population, and
Massive,
some of them joined that regiment. And so your book really helped me to kind of get a grasp of their likely experience in the service. Did you find any surprises when you were getting into looking at some of those experiences of those men in the service?
I suppose that apart from when I first started, the most surprising thing was just that they're everywhere. right? So, because I mean, and I think we do think, these guys are joining the Irish Brigade, and there's a few elsewhere. There might be a company here, a company there. It's a very different experience to the Germans in that sense, because the Germans tended to be much more cohesive in terms of their unit selection. A lot of it to do with, people didn't like the fact that they spoke a different language and things like this, But the breadth is incredible. So like the guys you're talking about, and that's the important element, I think, that is the Irish experience of the war. The Irish experience of the war isn't the Irish Brigade. They're an exceptional unit, and it's not even these other green flag like the 69 Pennsylvania. They are not the typical experience. It is these handful of guys. So it is the fact that really you can almost not pick a unit, particularly if it's raised in an urban centre anywhere in the north. And that's the way we have to reframe it now. When we're thinking of the Irish experience, it's not where did the Irish Brigade of these green flag units fight. It's where did urban units fight, particularly out of states like New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, etc. I suppose one of the other ones was that level of cohesion that you nearly always see with them. So you have 4, 5, 6 guys in a company. They tended to coalesce. And it wasn't based, and this is the other big one, people who like Civil War stuff, we like to look at our rosters and we like to look at where people are born and go, there were 50 Irish, there were 20 English, there were 10 Canadians. That's one of the interesting things about this experience. The Irish experience is not based on where you're born. It's based on whether you're part of the ethnic community, and that it included people who were Irish born, and then an awful lot of the people we see who are British born and Canadian born and obviously American born are Irish American. They see themselves as that. And you see these people knitting together, or they tent together, they eat together, they write letters for each other. A lot of these people are illiterate. They're the least literate white group in the north at this period. And so you're seeing that kind of coalescing of them. That's probably the most. I mean, the other was what the letters tell you about why they serve, which I was expecting to be a bit more difficult to extract, I suppose. And obviously, you're dealing with, I estimate that 250,000 of the United States military was Irish American, that you can classify them as that in the Civil War. 180,000 Irish born and 70,000 children of Irish born parents. Like it is the degree to which there is a relative clarity about why a lot of them are serving, which kind of goes against there's a few of them are myths that have grown up, and a few of them are based around analysis of things like the Irish Brigade, which is perfectly reasonable to do, but I think it kind of is a bit of it gives you a bit of a different sense of why a lot of them are joining up.
Yeah, the letters themselves are just fascinating. I mean, the tidbits that you're able to extract, and I immediately, and this is the historian in me that just goes immediately to the primary source analysis piece of just like finding these letters. And I've done some work in those pension files as well through Fold 3 and looking at these and just trying to find anything in those units that I was looking at. I immediately went to this was tedious. So to find this in among those 100,000 plus that have been digitized, to find not only pensions with letters, which are, my experience going through them is it's not necessarily a normal thing to find.
No,
those.
It's rare. Yeah, it's rare.
Yeah. But then to find it specifically for men that are in these that are in the Irish immigrant community. So what was your process like, other than, I know that you're probably clicking through, but were there ways that you narrowed things down? Were you looking at surnames? What was your process like for this?
Yeah, so I mean, that is one of the things I suppose that I'm fortunate with, because I'm not actually very good technically with anything, but I do like a good Excel spreadsheet, right? So I always start off with an Excel spreadsheet, the amount of Excel spreadsheets I have on various things. And so that was kind of my starting point. And for anyone who doesn't know kind of the Fold 3 system, you can't just go onto it and go, I want Irish immigrants or anything. With these pension files, you have to go by state, by unit, and by company, and then there's a list of names, and you have to then click in and it opens. What I did was, and I suppose my background in archaeology and history in Ireland helped a lot in this, is I did use surname analysis, which, and I will say this at the outset, and I maybe might mention this in relation to another project, Andersonville, in a minute, but it is problematic, right? Because there are a lot of Irish immigrants who don't have names like Murphy and Gallagher and O'Donnell or whatever, So, but it excludes a significant, although I have plenty of them in the book, people who are maybe Protestant, like Anglicans and Presbyterians. A lot of people from around the city of Dublin would have names that could be from England or from America for that matter, So there is a bit of bias in it. But I just systematically went through every single unit of and all of the Navy, which nearly all of them have been digitized. They run up into the late 1890s. So I think it was about 168,000 files. So I went into every unit, opened up every company. I assessed the names. If I thought that the unit came from somewhere, that there was a likelihood of ethnicity, or if the name had a chance of being Irish, I would then digitally open the file, look at it, and you do become quite quickly aware from looking at digitized images if there's letters in them. They tend to have a different look to a lot of the forms that are kind of crisper and everything in them. And then I would look at them, assess them. Then the next step was to try and prove or establish if the person was Irish American. So to be included in the database, you had to have direct evidence, either going back through census or compiled military service records or something that said that this person was Irish or that their parents were, to include it. So there was a big process. That's why it took 8 years to do it. But the of going through it and then just building it. I'm reading the letters, and I would record a overview of what the content of the letters was, like kind of, it touches on religion, it touches on economy, it touches on XYZ. And that is I still have it. I'm still adding to it. Like, I didn't get all the letters, but so that was the basis for getting these letters together. So and it ended up with, and now I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but there's significantly more than 1,050 or something. But so that process allows you to do that, and it's kind of a process I follow in an awful lot of what I do. We started another project. A good friend of mine, Jackie Bedell, who actually oversaw the digitization of those files in the National Archives. She and I started another project called the Andersonville Irish Project, where we took Andersonville is the deadliest place in the Civil War for Union troops. More of them died there than anywhere else, right, because of the circumstances there and the period of time. And so we've started to go systematically through the men who died there looking for Irish. And that's quite interesting, because that different approach has pulled out a lot more than of, these Dublin people, more of these Presbyterians, more of these Anglicans. So you can see how these different approaches give you different sets of correspondence to deal with. But yeah, that's effectively it. But it is all down. You have to like your spreadsheets. You want to be doing this. But every one of them is a different story, as you were alluding to there, Jake, isn't it? I mean, there's no escaping these files once you start getting into them, because it's just unbelievable, the material. Even if there's no letters in them, it's unbelievable, the material that's contained in them.
Yeah, it's amazing too. I'd say, from going through them, and I imagine you had this experience too when you may go through 50 of these files and just, there's interesting information in them, but there's nothing that's particularly, like, a lot of it is just the forms, you'll see the names, you see some of the circumstances of the lives lived. But then when you click into that one file and it has 101 scanned images, and it's just like, ooh, well, there's a story here. Did you have, I imagine you had many of those moments of, like, when you came across something?
Oh, enormous. I have databases running back years of stuff that I still haven't had a chance to look into, and you get 3-4. I was looking at a file actually recently for a project I was doing in Ireland. It has 420 pages or something of a guy who he was actually a Confederate soldier until late 1863, which is why his federal pension file is this long. There's always, in those ones, some really interesting social element. And what I'm actually still trying to convince Irish historians of, for the widows and dependents, which I work on, really the main story in them, even though I've just written a book about the soldiers, it's the women. Women is what it tells you the most about in these. And it's a fact that these files created by the United States government are actually the richest source of social information about the ordinary lives of women from Ireland that exists anywhere. There's nothing in Ireland like it that exists like this. And so when you look at it from that perspective, like, almost anything in them can be really interesting. Like, where are they getting married? Who's marrying them? Like, what networks, immigrant networks, who's giving statements on their behalf? Are they from the same place in Ireland? All of this sort of stuff begins to feed into it. And there's just so many different ways you can look at it. Yeah, some of those kind of really detailed ones. Although I will say this in relation to, I've been doing some work on the post-Civil War regular army, and during trips to the National Archives, I've been pulling some files relating to these guys. And I was looking at a few of them, and they came out and they were like so thin, like really, really thin. And they came out from the stacks. These are undigitized files, obviously. But came out from the stacks, and I was like, oh no, I was really hoping there'd be a load in this. But then, this has happened to me now on a number of occasions. I've opened them, and the reason they're so thin is because the mother or the widow just handed in all the letters that the guy wrote. And so they prove instantaneously their and so you just never know. Like everyone, it's every one of them is a discovery, whether you're looking at them in real life or digitized. It's just breathtaking what the potential every time you click on an image or open one of these files is.
Yeah, and that's something too that I love about the book and about the research you do and what you were writing on the blog. And we, first kind of crossed paths when I was working at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and you were writing for the Irish and the American Civil War blog. And what I always loved about your writing and the stories that you were telling is they're the stories of the average soldier, the story of the working class. And those are the stories that resonate with me most. I do have an interest in American Civil War history, in part because of working at the Civil War Medicine Museum, but even before that. And my interest never was specifically in battlefield, traditional military history.
Yeah.
I have many friends that do that, work on the National Park Service, and love that, the tactics on the battlefield, the grand strategic picture. That was never my interest. My interest always lay with the individual experience, whether that's a soldier at the front lines and their experience in combat, which you pull out some amazing accounts in your work in Green and Blue. But then, yeah, like you said, the story of the families on the home front and what happens when, inevitably, from just based on the resources that you're using, when their loved one dies, because it's, the tragedy that underlies all of this, all of these pension files, is that somebody died.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's those are the stories that I feel are also have been undertold.
Yeah, and I think and it was something I tried to kind of refer to in the book, but, there's so much written about the American Civil War, and there's so much on Civil War soldier studies and so much fantastic work. I do think immigrant stuff is maybe still a bit kind of peripheral. I think I'm surprised that actually, particularly in recent years, hasn't become a bit more central. It still feels like it's a bit peripheral. But the one of the big areas I think that we don't still really understand are urban working class poor who enlist in enormous numbers. I've and there's been some work done on this, but I think the Irish are maybe a good vehicle for seeing some of this, but they're not alone. Why people in the 5 Points or wherever it is are enlisting in the Union military, because it's not the same necessarily as people who might be coming from, I kind of classify as, say, Ohio farm boys or whatever, the Ohio lads who have massive participation in things. But these type of communities, the people who are coming out of the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania, like, what's driving them? And they're absolutely central to Union victory in the war. And I don't think we understand them, because the kind of well-written letters of even, kind of decently educated enlisted men, but particularly officers, and kind of, the flowery language of kind of sacrifice and stuff, it's not something you see that much in a huge number of working class letters. And so that is a kind of an area that I think we do need a lot more work on in the Civil War generally, is these kind of groups of people who aren't who are vital and often make up a majority of some of the armies, like, the Army of the Potomac and stuff, that we still haven't really got to grips with. Because even just on the officer thing, like, I mean, that's something you see even with the Irish. Even with the Irish, you see a difference between officers and enlisted men. You see it even with them. So the Irish have a lot of problems, obviously, in relation to nativism and things against them. But you even see this kind of class element between officers, Irish officers and the Irish enlisted men, that emerges. Their story is the one, because, well, number one, it's from an Irish perspective anyway, it is the most common story. It's the most important story that we have to get at. And really, they've always been the people that interest me more. Like it's not the great and the good. That's Irish people generally, particularly in kind of 19th century, when you're looking at people, always have a bit of a suspicion of the great and the good anyway. So
Yeah.
which I think the Irish people in the 19th century certainly had. But it's those stories that just tell you what they're trying to deal with from the whole immigrant experience onwards.
Were there any particular stories or individuals who stood out to you in the research that their stories really touched you?
Yeah, I'll say there's one. There's one I often refer to. He's a guy called John Hayes. He was in the 105th New York out of Rochester. And his story actually emerges through this is one of the kind of things about the pension files. His story emerged through a set of letters that relate to another Irish soldier, who most of the letters are written early in the war when he wasn't in the army. He hadn't joined up, and spends a lot of time going like, why would you join up? But then he does join up, and he gets killed actually in April 1965 in the 23rd Illinois Infantry at Petersburg. But he makes reference to this friend of his, John Hayes. And I thought this was a particularly interesting case. John Hayes was away fighting at the front, and his wife was back in Rochester, who was pregnant with twins, as it transpired. And the army was not meeting it wasn't managing to pay these guys regularly, right? So this created mass problems for the working class poor, who weren't they didn't own the buildings they were living in. They were renting. They often had dependents who were reliant on consistent money coming back for them. And so this creates an enormous problem for them. But anyway, John Hayes hasn't been paid, and his friend says that he enlists because he couldn't get work. His wife is pregnant, but because he hasn't got paid, she can't keep up the rented house that they're in. And she is forced to move into even smaller tenement accommodation only because an aunt gives her some money to tide her over. But apparently it's really damp and dank and tiny. She gives birth, and then she dies as a result of the conditions she's living in. And John Hayes, who still hasn't got paid, part of the reason he enlists, not the entire reason he enlists, is economics, and this is early in the war. And he just gets this letter telling him where he had 5 children, I think it was, and all the different institutions that they'd been put in back in. They weren't even put in the same institution, different institutions that they were placed in. And he gets this, and he doesn't desert, actually. He does later in the war, but that at this point he doesn't. He stays, and he actually does get promoted to become an officer at one point, a lieutenant. But that sort of stuff is real hard, and you come across that sort of stuff really quite frequently. The incredible consequences for those people living on the margins in Northern society if a major breadwinner wasn't getting money or wasn't getting paid. And that type of story instantly shows you why these guys aren't writing back going, you have to grin and bear it here. We're fighting for the future of the country. I know there's going to be hard. Like, you can't say that. People are being put out in the street. You can't say it. And that occurs quite frequently. But what's remarkable then is that these guys aren't deserting en masse because of that. And really, you should expect that they would. There is high levels of desertion among the Irish, but they're not doing it. And that type of story shows you the degree to which, in my view, the working class, this kind of day-to-day experience and concerns about their family or themselves and the conditions around them play into this as well, always is the most important aspect. It isn't, what's Abraham Lincoln doing here, or what are the South at, or any of this. It's driven by the necessities of their everyday life. And that's something that really, I think, kind of comes out. But through stories like Hayes, I use his story in the book as an example of that, but there are plenty of others as well.
Yeah, the plain spoken nature of these letters too, and just how to the point they are. You mentioned earlier the kind of flowery letters of maybe more well-to-do officers or enlisted men. What I've always been struck by, and this came through in Green and Blue as well, and I remember this in Peter Carmichael's book, War for the Common Soldier as well, is that some of these descriptions of combat specifically from these soldiers are so vivid, in part because they're not making them, they're not going through this filter of higher class where there's this flowery sentimentalism almost. Can you talk a little bit about some of those letters and the letters and the descriptions of combat and of the Civil War experience for those soldiers?
Yeah, so like some of them are incredible. Like the best one, and I think it's the most effective one I've ever read. And it's some of these letters are quite difficult to understand, because
Hmm.
they're not really fully literate, so they're phonetically written, and some of them are phonetically written in Irish accent. There's one, and I'm not going to read it out. It's in the book. It's a little passage of a guy. I think he's down in Bermuda 100, like, and he's gone into combat, and it's just he's writing to his mother, like, and it's just the terror of the line of battle as they advance, and he's talking about, I'm paraphrasing it here, coming in and the shells coming in everywhere, and then he got hit. He thought he got hit, and he came down. The guy in front of him spun around and knocked him down, and then he realized he wasn't hit, and like, but it's just the complete terror, and he's just stating what happened, and you see that in a lot of them. And as you mentioned, like Peter Carmichael's brilliant book, The War for the Common Soldier, shows a lot of this as well. There's just no sentiment kind of attached to it. It's you are stating what occurs, and so like you see there's a lot of similarities between most of the other soldiers, and that's what I would say. The soldier experience wider, it's kind of on the margins, on the extremes, that the Irish have different experiences and usually harder experiences than most of their comrades. But the kind of day-to-day about how they adapt to military life and things like this, and how they perform in combat and all of that, it's directly comparable to other
Hmm.
soldiers. But you are seeing things like, they're when they reach a battlefield, they're telling, and often writing to their mothers, talking about like people's bodies being ripped apart and people being decapitated and things like this. There's plenty of that sort of stuff. Like where I suppose in a general kind of the difference, to summarize some of the differences that they have with other groups who they're fighting alongside, is kind of things like it's more difficult for them to maintain connections with home because not as many of them can write letters. Right. So which makes it much harder to kind of maintain your morale. They're more economically vulnerable than a lot of other guys at home because of, the fact that a lot of them are living in rented tenements in urban centres, where there's less forgiveness for being delayed with your rent and things like this. For the majority of them are Catholic, obviously. They have significantly less access to their faith, to priests, etc., than most of the other men do to chaplains of their faith, which is problematic for guys, who want last absolution when they're dying, and families who want it as well. So you've kind of got these kind of more difficult extremes that a lot of them are facing, which is what explains a lot of things like, they have a slightly higher desertion rate than other troops, but that is primarily economic. But the other thing, I suppose, in terms of like dispelling myths, and there's a section on the book in this, it's a very important point to make. The Irish, and it's often said, but it is true, they did not like African Americans. They didn't have much interest in emancipation as a cause for the war. But it has been kind of seen that, after Antietam, after the Emancipation Proclamation, etc., that there's a kind of a mass Irish turn against the war. But you don't see that in terms of representation of the Irish in the military, and you don't see it in terms of them going, all right, I'm out of here now, this isn't what I was fighting for. You see a lot of them staying the course through the war. And it's the other element of their letters that's in this kind of matter-of-fact way. The other thing that they don't talk about the way you will often read in officers' letters is why they're fighting. So I alluded to it earlier. There's two reasons. One is economic, and that's from the very start of the war. There's an idea out there that people didn't enlist at the start of the war for money. They absolutely did. They absolutely did. Loads of people lost their jobs in working classes in the north, and they enlist. But it's often not the only reason, because the other reason is they see this sense of duty that they have to perform to their country. And when they refer to their country, and it usually doesn't matter if they got off the boat from Ireland the week before or 10 years previously, it's the United States. But they rarely go, I'm fighting for, they don't go into big, long reasons for doing this. They talk about, more or less, in matter of fact, often one or two sentences, doing their duty. Like, I'll come home when we've won and not before. It's very simplistic, matter of fact. This is something I have to do because my country needs me to do it. And it kind of shows you the degree to which they had committed most of these Irish communities to the United States by the time of the Civil War. That obviously they were hoping to kind of prove themselves somewhat to other people, but in their own view, they saw themselves as American. And that's how you use the term, and it's been used before by historians like Kevin Kenny, but the American Irish, that's how they see themselves. Their kind of raison d'etre, if you like, in the United States is to recreate their Irish communities in America as other communities had done before them, you know, and they view themselves in exactly the same way. So when they talk about the Rochester boys, who are nearly always Rochester Irish boys, or the Buffalo Irish boys, or Hudson Irish boys, or whatever it is. It's always those communities. They're not. There's an idea that a lot of these guys were looking for experience to go back and fight the British in Ireland, and they would have gone home if they wanted to. That's not true at all. Only a very, very tiny proportion of them ever wanted to do that. It's about a commitment. So that's kind of what you're seeing in terms of their general experience. Sorry, Jake, that's a very long-winded answer.
No. My next question was going to be about motivation, because you're talking about combat and the horrors that they experience. So what keeps them there? And you touched on that. Another area that I thought was very interesting in the book too, thinking about the economic motivators for Irish American service in the war. How do the bounties? So for listeners that may not be familiar with this, could you explain a little bit about the bounty system? Yeah. And then also how that impacted Irish enlistment in the later stages of the war, and how they were perceived by their comrades as well.
Yeah, so well, I'll start with this, because I do say in the book there needs to be a lot more written about these guys and stuff. This year has been a good year so far. There's been a couple of books out on us in relation to these late war guys. So in simplistic terms, right, that there's a kind of and this is very simplistic, but there's an enormous focus in Civil War studies on the early war volunteer, the guys who kind of go, the country's been threatened, and I'm talking about, it applies to both sides, but specifically talking about US service. The country's being threatened, I have to go and fight. And I don't like the term actually, but mercenaries, like who are financially motivated, right? And there's normally seen to be a very big break between these two groups of guys. In terms of finances, just to explain the bounty system, a lot of it comes in because of, I won't go into previous acts, but the Enrollment Act that brings in the draft, right? The famous draft riots in July 1863 in New York. Effectively, the army needs men, so the congressional district areas are given a quota of men that they require to get this number of volunteers in, and if they do not get to that number, a draft will be instituted, right? And so immediately you have bounty volunteers, where a town or a county will begin to fund money to try and get men in so that they reach their quota. You have another set of people then who if a draft occurs and a name is pulled from the draft, you have another group of people who will seek substitutes. Someone, if their name is pulled and they can do it in advance of this too, that will be paid to go in their place, right? So they're kind of the two classes. And initially, there's kind of limits put on the amount of money often that was given out for these, and that's kind of thrown out the window in 1864, in the middle of 1864, and the whole thing explodes. Needless to say, there's gigantic corruption and exploitation and everything goes all around this. You know, I have a case, I've written about him twice in this book, in the previous book, of a young Irish boy with a mental disability who was stolen out of a home in Troy and taken into a largely German unit under a false name, and enlisted by a conspiring officer and a local. But in any event, these guys are seen as like bad soldiers, right? These guys have no motivation. They'll run away, they'll desert, they won't do anything. And that's kind of been the wider narrative. There have been some important books out in recent years that have kind of pushed against it a little bit. But in terms of the Irish, and these guys are viewed badly, and immigrant groups, and particularly Irish immigrant groups, are viewed as being particularly bad at this, that these guys will come in and they'll enlist for a bounty, and then they'll bounty jump, they'll desert and go off and enlist for another bounty and another bounty and another bounty. And so kind of uniformly bad view of these guys. But when you look at it in the round, well, number one, you see from 1861, bang, there are guys being offered significant down payments, bounties, to enlist in 1861. They are bounties by any other term, often state bounties. Guys are frequently being offered things like, you'll be given a farm of 40 acres when you enlist. This is in 1861. And so you're seeing economics play an important role in attracting the working classes to the army from the off. But with the Irish, and this is the point I'm making about, I was referring earlier to, the idea that the Irish turn against the war from 1863. There hasn't been enough analysis done on these later wars soldiers yet, but all the information that we currently have suggests actually that immigrants were more willing to enlist as substitutes or as bounty volunteers than if you like, native-born white Americans were during this period. I think which tells you quite a lot. Like, it's important to remember the majority of military-age men in the North did not enlist in the American Civil War, right? So
Yeah.
immediately, if wire guys who enlist for money put below them on the kind of this imaginary scale of who's a good soldier and who's a bad soldier, the United States does not win the war without these men. It just does not win the war without them. And you look at the reasons a lot of these guys are doing it, and again, I cite a few examples in the book, are for much similar reasons from this economic perspective as a lot of the early war guys would have been doing it who had lost their jobs. They are looking to provide for their family. I have a case in there of a guy who comes down from Canada, an Irish guy, enlists in Vermont as a substitute, and he sends the money immediately over to Ireland, where his mother is in a poorhouse, and the money is used to get her over, and she lands there just as he's being killed in the Overland Campaign, fighting with his unit. Personally, I can't, maybe you get too emotionally involved with these people, but I can't look at that and go, well, look, this guy doesn't deserve to be kind of classed in this odd bracket with these people. But what you see with taking the Irish as a working class example is that there's kind of less animus towards these guys from early war volunteers, from Irish guys who enlisted in 1861 and 1862, because there's a general acceptance that economics is an important element of decision making and everything. They're more annoyed about guys who can kind of wander in for 90 days and go home than they are about somebody who might come across. And people were leaving Ireland. They were leaving Ireland from 1863 onwards with the express intent of enlisting in the United States military because of the money. It was life-changing money. It could bring their whole family with them to from if they survive. And plenty of them didn't, if they managed to survive. And so there's kind of an acceptance of this. And you see it in some of these early war volunteers are writing home going, oh, how is the draft gone? I hope none of my friends have been pulled. Their names haven't been pulled, like, because you don't want to be coming down here. And this kind of idea that, like, they're the ones who are taking the risk. They're doing it so that others don't have to do it. And that's kind of something that comes out, I think. You see it a bit in other groups too, and there has been a lot of good scholarship on that likewise, but you see it to a higher level with the Irish, I think. And where they're kind of hammering on about things like the draft and stuff, it's largely to do with kind of the rich others who are non-Irish, that they're the ones they're hoping get caught in the draft, because there is a perception, that these guys, whether it was true or it wasn't true, that these rich people were all avoiding service and getting poor men to do the work for them, and they were the ones at the front.
I found that section of the book particularly interesting, just talking about the perceptions of that and the economic incentives to serve, which makes sense when talking about, most of these being very working class on the edges of survival. Really, it just, again, it's really amazing to have some insight into what they're thinking about and how they perceive that, because that doesn't really exist anywhere else.
Yeah, and I often reference it in relation to this. A lot of our kind of popular imaginings of things like Irish enlistment in the army have been influenced by things like Gangs of New York. I often reference it, a film I like. It's normally the number one question I get asked is that scene in Gangs of New York where they have all these kind of semi-dopey Irish lads kind of who've hopped off the boat and are suddenly being given a uniform and a gun and kind of, where are we off to? But like in reality, these guys were coming to enlist. They were coming to enlist because they were willing to. And again, I've never been much for kind of the whole kind of moral thing of people are better if they fight because they have a kind of an ideological reason for doing so. I've not that. I just don't see that doesn't make you better than someone, in my view, someone who's willing to do it for money. I don't really see the difference because people have different priorities in life. But when you see the reasons a lot of these guys are doing it, it's perfectly understandable why they are. And again, the fact remains, despite the fact that there are bad stories in there, and I cite a couple of them, most of them stay in the army and do the duty that's required of them for the preservation of the country.
Well, I think we'll leave it there on the book. So listeners should definitely go out, pick up Green and Blue. We'll put a link to that in the show notes if you want to make it easy for you to go out and get the book and dive into what Damian has put together, which is just, like I said at the outset here, a really important addition to the Civil War literature in terms of immigrant experiences and in terms of the Irish experience in the American Civil War. So I want to go back a little bit. How did you get into this? How did you hone in on the Irish experience in the American Civil War to begin with?
Yeah, so I suppose it goes back to, I'm originally an archaeologist by training. I'm actually spending most of my time in the last few months back working as an archaeologist most of the time, and always did a lot of kind of public stuff around archaeology and military stuff. I suppose my specialism, although I often work in lots of different areas of archaeology and public archaeology, has always been kind of military and social military stuff, whether it be archaeological or history. And specifically for the Civil War, so I've always had an interest in the Irish military experience broadly in Ireland but particularly outside of Ireland, you know, as I say, with a big kind of social aspect to it as well. But back in 2002, it's a depressing length of time ago. For a few years there, I was a curator in the National Museum of Ireland in Collins Barracks, which part of that museum is the military exhibitions, the kind of national military exhibitions, and I was one of the curators who worked to develop that exhibition. It's still there; it's a permanent exhibition, so you can still visit it if anyone's going to Dublin. But we had it was the largest kind of single exhibition in the history of the state. There's a lot of different galleries that touch on different aspects, but one of them that I was particularly involved in kind of trying to find material and tell that story was the American Gallery. And so I had plenty of American Civil War books, but I had plenty of books about everything. So it was while doing that and the work as we were kind of preparing it and trying to identify objects and, you know, getting objects on loan from the United States and things that I was really just completely captivated by it. And that was when I was reading much more intensely about the war that I went, oh, this just isn't known. You know, we're kind of, in Ireland, we're well aware of a lot of the stuff, you know, Irish in the British service, for example, in the First World War and things. You get a lot of that. Obviously, our own independence struggle and our own Civil War, things like the 1916 Easter Rebellion and stuff, get an enormous amount of attention historically in relation to kind of conflict. But this was, because these were immigrants and very few of them ever came back, and so there's no direct familial connections often, was just kind of left out of this story. And it's actually the largest, aside from the First World War, and it's quite close, it's the largest military experience that Irish people have had in modern history, is the American Civil War. And so it was to tell that story, and really it was just a pastime. You know, back in 2010, blogging had kind of was the thing, you know, it had been on the rise. And I just did it because I always spend all my time, we were just talking about this before we started, we're both the same. Is it a blessing or a curse? It's up for debate. Always researching, always reading history, always looking at stuff. And I went, oh, you know, I'll start the blog to be a bit of fun on on the weekends. And then that was where that built to, oh, look at these pension files. As I say, until the day I go in the ground, I won't escape these pension files. Like, I never will. I've spent a lot of my time trying to convince people over the last 15 years in Ireland that they need to be looking at them for all aspects of stuff. So that was really where it developed, and it just kind of grew out of that. And it was the pensions that kept me so, it's far from my only interest, but it's that's what's held me the most to the whole period, has been that. But, you know, I still dabble in plenty of other things as well, both archaeologically and history wise. But they're never, the American Civil War is always number one on the list.
You know, thinking about the American Civil War, it's something that's been a theme in this podcast, as well as a theme of, I think I probably annoy most people in my life talking about the American Civil War and its perception today. So I'm curious, you know, we talk a lot about, in the past, we've talked a lot about how we remember the Civil War has changed drastically in the United States in the last 10 years. It's really become just a massive part of the civic conversation in America, the political conversation in America. I think in many ways for the worse. But, you know, I'm curious about that perception abroad, and that perception, as you've been doing this work and as you've been trying to raise the awareness of this Irish experience in the American Civil War happening simultaneous to this drastic shift in Civil War memory, and it's, being everywhere in American life and a big part of our national politics, which of course is kind of ends up being broadcast across the world. How has that been, has that changed anything in Irish perspectives or in European perspectives of the American Civil War? Or I'm just curious of that perception abroad.
This is a complicated topic in relation to Europe. I will say in Ireland and in Britain, right, everything that started with the whole, say, the Confederate monuments discussions and everything that emerged after the Gillian roof shootings and stuff, that all of that, because particularly in the English-speaking west of Europe, Britain and Ireland, we get American TV. Everybody watches American shows. It's an awful lot of American culture. That had a very powerful impact actually on, and has caused in Britain and Ireland a lot of people to address things like, the involvement in the slave trade and things like this. That wouldn't have happened if that hadn't happened in relation to, so it's happening with Trinity College in Dublin, for example, or examining their ties to, none of that would have occurred if the Confederate monuments issue hadn't occurred, which is a very interesting kind of transposition, I suppose, from the United States of that debate. There has been challenges as well. Like I would say, and I mean, I speak quite openly about this, I've been disappointed at the level of engagement we've ever been able to achieve in Ireland in relation to thinking about the impact of the war on immigrants. It has a very big impact on Europe more broadly, like a lot of Germans, Britain, Ireland, in particular, those three areas. And on people living in those locations, it has an impact, like people who never were in the United States in their lives. We were trying, for example, during the sesquicentennial, trying to get some events going in Ireland. And interestingly, there was a bit of a reluctance, I think, in parts of that, because it was seen, oh, look, this debate is blowing up in America. And we don't want to be touching this, so I think that you could say that was a bit of a challenge in relation to it. Again, it's a wider thing. I was alluding to it earlier that I've kind of been surprised that immigration hasn't been one of the things that's moved a bit more central to the Civil War history discussion field. And I'm not saying there isn't great work being done in it. I do think it's still seen as kind of, we'll do our tour day on the Germans at Chancellorsville or the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg. It's not really either, and I'm talking about in light of like current kind of politics, So I mean, that's one of the things that allowed us to kind of move the African American story back into the kind of as a central component of the Civil War, which I think is really important and right, and there's great scholarship being done on that. I have been a bit surprised that immigration hasn't on either side. Like I would have thought, people are talking about immigrants and let's look at this experience in the 19th century more, kind of that is pulled into the center. But you are actually seeing some co-option, which is quite interesting in relation to, maybe co-option is too strong of a word. A lot of the interest that I'm seeing now in relation to, say, the Irish experience in the American Civil War in Europe, where you could see that there's kind of a political element to it, is it's being used negatively in relation to contemporary politics, right? So, which I usually try and steer clear of in relation to discussing any of these, because it just, from my perspective, doesn't tend to end well. But but just in terms of its influence on how we're exploring that history, I think it's had an impact for both good and I would say bad as well, or negative. Maybe not maybe negative would be a better term. So, but there hasn't been a big upsurge. There are a kind of a very small number of very dedicated people in Ireland who are interested in the Irish and the American Civil War. And you know yourself, once you're interested in the American Civil War, it's all over for you. Like, it's just, that's it. And like, there are some of them. Britain has a much more established community of people. They have a great round table, the American Civil War Round Table UK, really dedicated, much bigger community, which I find quite interesting because so many Irish are involved in it and Irish immigration is so large. We don't, for example, have enormous numbers of historians in Ireland who fully focus on the Irish immigrant experience. most of the major scholars of Irish immigration are actually not in Ireland. They're in the United States or they're in Britain and places, which I think is interesting as well. So it's rarely kind of in the mainstream of Irish historical discussion or debate, or even in the peripheral stream of it when you're talking about 19th century Irish immigration to America, I would argue. Anyway, sorry, rambling and all over the place, but it's a very interesting topic in relation to it. I will say this. I was mentioning the Andersonville Irish project we had earlier. We did, and I'd like to give Professor Nicholas Allen in the University of Georgia a shout out here, who took a leading role in this. Our work on the Andersonville Irish project did actually lead to cooperation between the Irish government, the government of the Republic of Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Bureau, and where they came together, and we actually dedicated a monument that was funded by the Irish, by the states. The first one entirely funded by Irish governments in the United States of the Civil War, that led to the placing of a memorial at Andersonville to the impact of Andersonville on the men who died there and their families of all kind of religions and backgrounds on the island of Ireland, which was a big moment. And there's the state really kind of, I have to say, did well there. I would like to see more of it. It's quite interesting just thinking about the 150th versus now the as we move towards the kind of the celebrations of the birth of the United States. I mean, Ireland has gone gaga for this. There's no question about it. There's an awful lot of, there's conferences, there's events, there are plaques being unveiled, which I think is interesting in itself when you think about memory, isn't it? It's the much bigger event that kind of just, in terms of numbers I'm talking about, not necessarily significance, you could argue that point. But Ireland is really all in on celebrating the revolution, the American Revolution and things at the moment. It's a very big deal. You're coming across stuff all the time in relation to it. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and it's so multifaceted as it is in the US in a European context.
Yeah, no, I asked a big question there, or several big questions. So no, I appreciate your candor and sharing that. I think that, that's something that's always been very important to me. And even though, I grew up in, small town in Pennsylvania, I did not travel internationally until, I was in my current job working in the tourism industry just, 4 years ago. But I always have thought of things, thinking about, was fascinated by the impact of American history internationally and American ideals. And I imagine that, some of the interests from Ireland in the American Revolution are some of those ideals.
Yes.
Of the revolution that have inspired subsequent revolutions, including, as you've talked about in Transatlantic, talking about, the impact of the American Revolution in Ireland. So I'm always fascinated by this. And I think I wish more Americans would take themselves out of this American mindset that, it's America. It's like everybody's thinking about just what's going on here and not thinking about it in an international context. And I wish more people would have that as a part of their thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I don't want it to sound either, just because the Civil War doesn't get its due, in my view, in Ireland, but American history generally is a kind of a topic of fascination more broadly. In Ireland, just to take Ireland, we have very kind of navel gazing in relation to this. So again, we were talking about this. We like to claim connections to everything and anyone. So obviously you have anybody, and particularly I would say this, if it's kind of uncontroversial, is always a good one. Well, we have interesting, just from an Irish history perspective, interesting perspectives based on our own historical story, if you like. So Ireland would obviously view itself rightly as a colonized country by Britain right up until 1922. And so a lot of it is kind of a lot of even people's interests is kind of driven by that. I always think, just to take it to the 19th century Americas, 19th century United States, I often reference this, the war with Mexico. One of the things that a lot of people know about in Ireland, and would be decent interest to people who are into this area, is the story of the San Patricios, the Irish from the United States Regular Army who deserted and switched sides and fought with the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War. And like our president, when he was in Mexico, unveiled a little plaque and stuff like that a few years ago. And I've often kind of pointed to that as, yeah, but 99.99% of these guys were still in the US regular army, and we kind of don't tell, we don't look at them. But because the San Patricio story fits with our kind of perception of ourselves and our history, you know, that's the kind of thing that people tend to be interested in, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's kind of, you know, we have another interesting example. A very beautiful memorial was erected a few years ago in the town of Middleton, where I lived for many years, to the Choctaw Nation, for a donation that the Choctaw gave to Ireland during the famine, right? Wow. And so obviously what happened to Native Americans in America is a kind of a topic that appeals because of, you know, it's a colonial expansion that's doing it. And that's based on that, actually, you know, there's a scholarship in University College Cork for people of the Choctaw Nation. It gets consistently referenced. There's a huge amount of interest in that because it's seen as a story that links into our own past and our ideas of our past, which of course is much more complicated, and it's much more complicated when it comes to actually Native Americans in the US. But it's just another interesting, and I mean, there must have been PhDs and books written on it, but it is very interesting, and every country has little elements of that everywhere, you know, in how they kind of engage with and view American history, all the way through, you know, obviously to the Second World War and stuff, which is obviously an enormously popular topic of examination and debate throughout Europe.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about the book. So Damian, the author. We've talked about a little bit about Damian, the archaeologist. Although I think that at this point it's going to have to be a different episode. We've talked about Damian, the blogger, the researcher. Now I want to talk a little bit about Damian, the podcaster, since we are on this platform. So I will admit I've gone deep down an Irish history rabbit hole over the last,
as you should, Jake. Everybody should.
3 years. Yep. Prior to that, I will say I you know, prior to 2022, Jake knew very little about Irish history. But I've gone down the rabbit hole, and I have to say a huge thank you to you for your transatlantic podcast, as well as to your co-host there, Finn, with the Irish History podcast, which I think I've gone through the whole back catalog of that, which is quite extensive.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So just talk a little bit about, you know, why did you start Transatlantic? What is Transatlantic? And what are you guys hoping to do with that show?
Yeah, that was an exciting one, and it was all Finn's idea. So for anybody who doesn't know Finn, we met, by the way, down digging a 13th century castle ditch, you know, for
like
2 years. Yeah,
like
in the early 2000s in Dublin. So that was where we first encountered each other. But Finn has been one of the longest. He's been a professional history podcaster for many years, and has run the Irish History podcasts. It's an incredible, it covers everything in Irish history. It's how he manages. I don't know how he does it, but anyway, there's an enormous back catalogue. You should nearly get a medal, Jake, for going through it. The amount of content he has is exceptional. But obviously we've been friends for a long time, and he approached me with the idea, actually, that he wanted to kind of explore doing this, because he wanted to speak to America and Ireland, but principally, you know, people in the United States with this podcast that was specifically looking at it. And it's such an enormous story. Like, it doesn't take much persuasion to kind of go, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Because obviously for me, it also gives me an opportunity to kind of go, and I still do mention the Civil War, and normally I always try and slip at least a line in there in most episodes, but it allows me to kind of explore broader history, and I'm fascinated by American history in the round. So the idea was to just see how it went, really, initially. I think we're up to 35 or 36 episodes now. It's been going for nearly 2 years, a year and a half or so. And just an opportunity to try and kind of talk to different people like yourself, to kind of get an idea of specific regions, to talk about individuals, to talk about different periods of history. Because really, I mean, there's no end to what you can explore when you start looking at the story of the Irish in America. You know, again, different people, different persuasions, different periods, men, women, everything you can possibly want to touch is there. And you can tell it, and it gives you much broader kind of perspectives on things. You know, I'm very much in history, a 19th century person usually, and like to kind of explore stuff like, you know, who was the first Irish person who came to America, or look at stories like that of Mary Mallon, you know, known as Typhoid Mary and stuff like these type of people, and then to dive down into places like what's life like in the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania. What was it like if you were Irish in New Orleans? What's it like if you were Irish in Sacramento, which is an episode I've just recorded the other day. Yeah, it's just this opportunity that I hope provides the listeners with kind of on both sides of the Atlantic with some interesting kind of things. We've also tried to we hope to do more of it, like moving into things like, you know, Irish perceptions of Irish Americans and things like that, which is we touched on that in one episode, you know, about kind of how Irish people view Irish Americans and like the reasons why Irish American identity is a valid one, but not necessarily the same as Irish identity, which it often gets. Irish people often get confused as to the difference with, I think. But it's just a world of different things. And we've actually just been discussing what we're going to be doing next year. Like, because there's just, I think we say it every episode, Jake. We say it about 3 or 4 times. Oh, this would be a great episode as well, and this would be a great episode as well, and you know.
Yes, I love those. I love those bits because it's it's like, ooh, I get a little preview of what's
if we ever do it or
next.
not, of course, it's another question. But we have a long list now. We have a long list of stuff, but yeah, it's been really good. So I mean, it's down to Finn really. I mean, he drove the idea, and it's a bit like the pensions. He's completely suckered me into it anyway. I don't think I'll be stopping anytime soon.
That's great. It's I'll say I have a fondness for those place specific episodes. I think my favorite episode was the Wisconsin one.
Oh, Tim. Yeah, Tim was great.
It was so good and just so, he did a great job of describing, and it becomes, and I love this looking through. I like that hyper-local history has always been something that I focus in on one community and one neighborhood and one city, and it tells you a lot about the history of that city. It tells you a lot about the history of those people. And I love that as an avenue to get at some, get into the truths of history that kind of get lost in this bigger narrative that we have, whether it's about a city or about an immigrant community or about the country as a whole. So I love those episodes.
It's amazing the variance. Like, because again, I do it all the time. You kind of talk about the immigrant experience in the 19th century as X, but like then the minute you dive down, you're seeing completely different things. I mean, the discussion will be coming out in the new year that I just had in relation to Sacramento, and the interesting ways in which people kind of work together there because of it's a different experience in these Western cities that were exploding up in the 19th century than it was in the East. That the idea like that, we're trying to create something new here. And so not that there weren't tensions, obviously, particularly if you were Irish versus Chinese, which is an interesting dynamic versus Irish African Americans. Anyway, but but like just every place has that different element and different figures and stuff like that, and it's a fascinating way to approach stuff. And I mean, there's plenty of places in America, isn't there? So, and that alone we'd be going for a long time. Yeah,
you have episodes for decades in the future.
Exactly. We can go everywhere. We always try and add in at the end of those episodes as well, just a couple of minutes to ask. This is the archaeologist in us too, of course, but the like where you can see now that relates to these places, So we always get some recommendations when we have people on as to if you find yourself in Sacramento or New Orleans, where should you go, or Wisconsin, or the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania, as to what you should look at if you want to get a bit of a deeper insight into what these people were experiencing.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we're going to leave it there, Damian. Thank you so much for coming on and recording from across the world. I love that fact that we can just do this from.
Yeah, it's incredible.
You're in Finland. I'm here in Maryland and able to do this. It's really quite amazing.
It is. It's incredible. It's a changed world. We couldn't have done it 20 years ago. It's super. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here. And listeners out there, be sure to pick up a copy of Green and Blue, Damian's book that we talked about at the beginning of this episode, and definitely go out and subscribe to Transatlantic and listen to that podcast. And I think you'll be delighted by the conversations that they have on that podcast as well.
Particularly Jake's episode. It's really good.
You didn't hear it from me. All right. Thanks, Damian.
Thanks a million, Jake.
That's it for today. A huge thanks to Damian Shiels for joining me from across the globe for this episode. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, you are going to love Damian's book, Green and Blue. We've got a link in the show notes if you want to pick that up. And be sure to check out Damian's podcast with Finn Dwyer, Transatlantic. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. And if you can, rate and review the podcast. It's the best way to help the show reach more listeners. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back soon with more episodes of Public History.